So what do you think when you hear the words cancel culture? What rolls through your mind? Just saying that phrase will polarize a room these days. We live in the kind of culture in which you say the wrong word, you have the wrong action. Not only are there consequences for that word and for that action, in whatever job or position you have now, any future position or any future job or any future status is also canceled. And just this week, we had two high-profile people, one in sports, one in the entertainment world, lost their jobs because of outcry from people. Now, I'm not going to sit here and justify anything that was said by those that lost their jobs. However, how it all went down, all the things that took place, part of our cancel culture. The outcry worked, and especially because of our social media world these days. And this is about living, this is not about justifying those who may have done something wrong, who did something wrong. This is about the lack of forgiveness. This is about retribution. This is about vengeance. This is a culture in which no forgiveness is ever given. This is a culture that refuses to allow second chances. All atonement, all vengeance, never forgiveness. That's our culture. It's driven by this sense of, an arbitrary sense of justice, in which justice is never satisfied. And there's revenge and jealousy and even arbitrary karma. Tit for tat. You know, over Christmas, as I was thinking about some of the stuff that went down this week, and thinking about how people there is just no room for forgiveness. In fact, the moment you mention forgiveness is the moment you yourself are canceled. Over Christmas, I watched a new rendition of The Christmas Carol. It's a couple years old now, but it was the first time I saw it. And it was supposed to be the new thing. It was supposed to be a Christmas Carol understood through the lens of, the 21st century. Of course, The Christmas Carol is a story, it's a British story, of a man named Ebenezer Scrooge. And Ebenezer Scrooge is not a nice guy. In fact, he's a very, very bad man. He has no empathy. No empathy for the poor, no empathy for the vulnerable, no empathy for anybody who is less fortunate than him. To the point where his own employees, they work for him, but they are treated very, very rudely and unkind. But in the end, Ebenezer Scrooge, having discovered the true meaning of Christmas, he gets a visit by three ghosts. And by the way, if you haven't heard the story or watched the movies, spoiler alert here, he gets a visit from three ghosts. And at the end of it all, he understands the true meaning of Christmas. He's a changed man. In fact, Charles Dickens, who's writing this story, says at the very end that Scrooge is as good a man as the good old city knew. He became the best of the best, seemingly overnight. See, Scrooge, even in his life, and Dickens chronicles this for us, as Scrooge makes his way as a new man through the streets of the city and comes in contact with his employees and come in contact with his family. You find employees and family who are embracing him in forgiveness. And this further fuels Scrooge's goodness. That's the story that Dickens wrote, but that's not the story that was told in this new rendition. In this new rendition, Scrooge gets to the end of it all, And the people that are surrounding him are not willing to forgive, and he's okay with that. Why? Because this story is now being told through 21st century viewpoint, through 21st century eyes. Because in our society, we are not about to let Scrooge off the hook for all those years of treating employees and treating family like dirt. As less than, we're not about to give that guy forgiveness. He's got to make his penance. In fact, that's the end of this. That happens at the end of this new rendition. There's a conversation in which Scrooge says, "I'm going to try and make this all good," and one of the characters is saying, "Yeah, well, we'll see." There's no hope in that. That is our cancer. I was devastated because, first of all, Dickens is being driven by a gospel of grace. But that doesn't mesh with our society bent on making sure that if you mess up, if you screw up in a big way, that you have no second chances, that there is no forgiveness. And if we point fingers at our culture, at a culture that is way, and by the way, it's this way on both sides of the aisle, whether you are conservative or progressive, whether you're Republican or Democrat, whether you're part of conservative Christianity or liberal Christianity, both sides have engaged in this, and we've seen it in the last year. We're going to point fingers at our culture. Christianity's been doing this for a long time. In fact, this week, one of the most influential apologists of our day, there was a story in Christianity Today, all the sordid details of the stuff he was engaged with. One of the biggest names in apologetics in Christianity in the 20th century. And what's interesting is, it was a reminder of how voices were ignored all along the way. Voices were canceled. I grew up in a context in which if you did certain sins, you were basically excommunicated from the community. And if you weren't excommunicated, there were still consequences that you had to work your way through for years before you might be accepted, before you'd be allowed to back into certain positions or to do certain things. We have our own, and have had our own, cancel culture. Again, it doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on. We've done this. Now we're working our way through God's top 10. His top 10 commands, his top expectations, first of all, for Israel's life as a nation. But also top 10 expectations for us. Again, what does it mean to be a Christian? What guides our life? Our commandment today, we break so fast. I was thinking, we break it so fast that if it were a clock, it'd be a fan. And we don't think of this commandment this way. We look at this commandment, oh, I've never done that. But by the time you get from Genesis to Revelation, by the time you get through the entire Bible, you begin to realize, yeah, there's more going on than meets the eye with this command. So here it is, do not murder. We read it earlier. Do not murder. It's fairly simple. Fairly simple, right? But it's more extensive than any of us want to admit. After all, even this very one, do not murder. We can't even get out of the first few chapters of the book of Genesis. In human history, we can't even get out of the first family, and it's already being violated. Adam and Eve leave the garden. Adam and Eve start a family. They have 2 sons. The 2 sons, by the time we get to Genesis 4, grown men. And apparently they've been taught how they are supposed to worship. They've been taught by God what is appropriate worship. and what is not appropriate. Here's what Genesis 4 says. Mike read this moments ago. Abel became a shepherd of flocks. Cain worked the ground. Now, if you're listening to this as Israel, by the way, Moses is writing this a couple thousand years later. He's writing this down for Israel. They're making their way through the desert. They're on their way to the promised land. So he writes Genesis, he writes Exodus, he writes Leviticus, he writes Numbers, he writes Deuteronomy. And so he's writing Genesis. He's giving them their backstory. And so Abel became a shepherd. Well, this is a nation of shepherds. I mean, their ears perk up. Oh, hey, this is our story. We know this story. Abel became a shepherd of flocks, but Cain worked the ground. Now, in the course of time, Cain presented some of the land's produce as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also presented an offering, some of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. The Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but he did not have regard for Cain and his offering. So God accepts Abel's offering. And what do you hear in Abel's offering? Again, if you're Israel listening to this, what you hear is what God expects on account of sin. There's a blood sacrifice. We've already seen this. Adam and Eve leave the garden with the skin of an animal on their backs because God is giving them grace. If they're going to leave the garden alive, he said, if you disobey me, you're going to die. And something died. An animal died. So they've taught their children this. So Abel gives a sacrifice. And if you track Israel and their history and you follow the instructions that God gives them, sacrificing a lamb was all part of their sin offerings. Because the Bible says, without shedding blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Abel knows this. Cain knows this. And Cain, like his mother and father, deciding, I think I know better. I think I know best. Abel's making a blood sacrifice. Cain is not. He's decided he's going to be his own God. And God warns Cain. We know this because this is what God warns Cain. This is what he says. Do what's right. You do what's right. You present the right kind of sacrifice. Otherwise, sin is crouching at the door, which is an interesting choice of words for God because who do we know or what do we know that crouches, ready to devour? Sin is crouching at the door to devour you, Cain, if you don't do what's right. If you do not respond in faith. You see, Abel is presenting a sacrifice done in faith. Abel believes the promise. God's promise to fix the sin problem, and he's going to do it through offspring. The offspring of Eve. Abel believes the promise, but Cain doesn't. God says, you know what? This isn't going to end well for you. There is nothing good at the end of where you're going, Cain. The problem with Cain is Cain doesn't bother with another go-round. He hears God say this, and what does he do? The very next verses says, while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother and killed him. It's almost like Cain does not waste much time. Not a lot of time frame between verse 7 and verse 8. Sin is crouching at the door. Cain ignores it all. Why is Cain? Because Cain is not living in faith. Cain doesn't believe the promise. So much so that his first response in the heart is to shut Abel up. It's kind of fascinating what Cain does. In order to get back at God, He's upset with God, so then he takes out the brother. Takes out the brother. Rather than killing an animal for his own sin, who does he kill? God, you want a sacrifice? Well, here you go. Cain is not interested in atonement. He's not interested in forgiveness. He's only interested in revenge and retribution. So he cancels Abel permanently. Cain is trying to shut Abel up. But the opposite happens. Here's what God says. What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. He tries to cancel Abel, and the very opposite happens. Trying to shut Abel up, your blood is crying out. And the New Testament writers pick up on this. One of the first sermons preached in the entire Bible isn't coming from anybody's lips, it's coming from blood. The blood itself is crying out. The blood itself is making a proclamation. The only way to be right with God is for a blood sacrifice. Abel's blood is proclaiming faith in the promise. Abel's blood is proclaiming forgiveness in faith through the one who has made the promise. Faith in the one who gives life and grace to those who come seeking him for forgiveness and redemption. Abel's blood cries out. And if Cain thought he could shut Abel up, what he gets is an earful. What God gets is an earful from Abel's blood, the world's first murder. The world's first murder. And since then, it's happened millions and millions and millions of times in the course of history. What's fascinating about this, as I thought about this week, God gives us the first record of the first murder. And what's interesting about this particular murder, the very first one, it's not over like a drug deal gone bad. It's not really in a fit of anger over a loved one. You know, it's not in a fit of passion. It's not over somebody who's been cheating. No, the very first murder was over sacrifice. The very first murder was an instance of somebody canceling somebody else because of sacrifice. Think about that for a minute. Over God's acceptance of somebody else, God's acceptance of faith. Murder over the insistence that I am going to do things my way, I don't need God. Murder over right standing with God, what it means to have right standing, and what it means to be accepted by God. That happened again in the pages of Scripture. You know where else this happened? Where somebody was murdered over right standing with God and what it takes to be good with God and what God is requiring for things to be acceptable with Him. You know who else is murdered? Jesus. Jesus. God sends His only Son into the world to redeem His people from their sins, to make things right with God. And what do? What do God's people do? We kill Him. We don't want His message. We want our own way. We want our own works. We want ourselves to be the ones that are in charge of things. And the guy that's come saying, hey, I'm the only way to God, I'm the only way for you to have access to God, and it's all through redemption and forgiveness, we kill him. We cancel him. We're not interested in what he has to say. And you know what Jesus' blood preaches? It preaches forgiveness. His blood cries out. In fact, as he's being crucified, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. Jesus is forgiving the very people who are trying to cancel him out. Father, forgive them. Cancel Jesus. We're in the business of canceling Jesus all of the time. All of the time. Anytime my way rears its ugly head over somebody else, I'm canceling Jesus. We're in the business of trying to shut Jesus up. And how does Jesus respond to us? What does he give us when we do that? His blood. Forgiveness. Grace. Life. Salvation. Do we deserve it? Absolutely not. We've tried to cancel him. Instead, what does he do? He forgives and gives us grace. He gives us salvation. He makes us his own. The very people that we're trying to cancel him, he welcomes and embraces them. He embraces us. Now, the scriptures give multiple reasons why murder is wrong. We read one of those this morning, not the least of which when he's talking to Noah. Murder's wrong because man is made in God's image. Man is made in God's image, and so when we murder, when we take out somebody, we are making a direct assault on God himself, God in his image. You cancel someone, you're canceling God. But Jesus reminds crowds, as he's talking on the Sermon on the Mount, that this phrase, do not murder, has more going on than simply the act of taking somebody out. In fact, one of his followers, John, picks up on this later. This is what John says in 1 John. Everyone who hates his brother or sister is a murderer. Everyone who hates his brother or sister. And Jesus has said something similar. You hate a brother or sister? Then you're guilty. And you're going to stand in judgment of murder. Everyone who hates. You see, murder starts in the heart. And so even though we don't pull the trigger, even though we don't take out the knife, murder's already happened on the inside. Murder's already going on in here. To hate somebody is to be guilty of the same thing, to be guilty of pulling the trigger. Because what happens is when we hate somebody inside, we basically eliminated them from our existence. And we'd like to eliminate them from all existence, only we have this little conscience thing in there saying, oh, hey, you can't do that. But we've already done it inside. We've eliminated them from existence. We have canceled them, acting as if they don't exist. The silent treatment. Murder 101. Murder 101. Silent treatment. Acting as if somebody doesn't exist. But it goes a step further than this. If this is what's going on in the inside, then any kind of harm that I do to somebody else intentionally is murder. Doing harm to somebody intentionally, again, the implication on the backside of it, inside the heart, is you're less than human. You don't deserve existence. And so we write people off and we do people harm with words, with actions. The net effect of doing somebody harm is canceling them out. So every time we attempt to cancel somebody else, every time we attempt to harm somebody with a word or action, we're in violation of this commandment. You understand why I said the stuff going on inside of here, that this commandment, if we were to chronicle all the violations in our own lives, it'd be like a fan. It's constantly moving, constantly going. This is why Jesus was so hard on people over and over again. One of the most frequently used statements of Jesus is, if you don't forgive somebody else, God the Father will not forgive you. And that's a bad place to be. Why is that? Because Jesus is aiming at our hearts. Forgiveness begins here. If you don't forgive, there's no hope of heaven for you. Why is that? Because a heart that doesn't forgive is a heart that's filled with murder. A heart that's filled with anger. A heart that's filled with rage. Constantly canceling other people. Withholding forgiveness is treating somebody else as if they are not human. Now, I'm saying this because we do this all the time. I'm saying this because this is what Jesus forgives when he forgives us our sin. And again, when we're canceling somebody else, Jesus is very explicit that when you cancel somebody, you might as well be canceling me. In fact, he says that in Matthew 25. Jesus says this is what murder looks like. This is what not murdering someone looks like. So what is it we're supposed to be doing then in keeping this commandment? This is what Jesus says. The king, and this isn't a blessing to sheep. He's got the sheep on the one side, the goats on the other. He's telling a story of what happens at the end of time. He says, the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty. You gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. And the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or without clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? The king will answer them, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me. That is a picture of forgiveness. That's the opposite of cancel culture. In fact, it's understanding the grace that goes with this that is the answer to cancel culture. We have the answer right here among us for the kind of culture we live in which a culture that is not interested in forgiveness, not interested in grace, not interested in second chances. This is second chance, third chance, fourth chance, fifth chance for me and for you. And we're used to thinking about this passage in terms of, and we see the least of these and we think, oh, this is for the poor and the unfortunate and the less fortunate. It is. At the same time, he uses that word brother and sister. All of us are in this. This is the way we're to be treating each other. This is the kind of grace that we extend to each other. That when I treat you in forgiveness and grace as a brother or sister, I'm doing it as if I'm doing it to Jesus. Which I find amazing. We tried to cancel him. We did cancel him. He gives us forgiveness. And so this is what we do. When we understand forgiveness and how much we have been graced and how much forgiveness we have gotten from him that we don't deserve, we turn around and we do this for each other. We do this for the less fortunate. We do this for our city. This is the life of a forgiveness culture. Last week was the Super Bowl, and we all watched from a distance, right? I had a great time, by the way, in our neighbor's driveway. In Tampa, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are playing at home, but again, because of COVID, only a certain number of people were allowed into the stadium. And among them, there was a guy by the name of L.J. Gavani. And he's a Tampa Bay Buccaneers fan. Now, they let a very small percentage of people into the stadium, but in order for the stadium to look full, if you noticed on TV, there were a bunch of cutouts. There were cardboard cutout fans that they stuck in every seat. Make it look full. Well, L.J. Gavani, he's the owner of a brewery and a business there in Tampa. So he and his wife are sitting there, and they're sitting next to a cutout of a Kansas City fan. You could buy if you want your face on the cutout, you can buy your way in. So you pay, probably a couple $100 to get your face, so you can sit there if you can't make it. And so there's a Kansas City fan. So during the game, he starts tweeting, and people take notice. This kind of goes viral. He's sharing a beer with the guy. He's sharing chicken fingers with the guy sitting with the cardboard cutout. It's fascinating. It became just, okay, what's next? And when Tampa won, of course, there's the picture of him celebrating and kind of, basically saying, hey, your team didn't win. Sorry about that. What's interesting is because this went viral, they were able to find the guy whose picture was in the cardboard cutout. And his name was Clayton Whipple. This past week, LJ and Clayton, by the way, there's a picture of him offering a beer to Clayton. They had a Zoom call. They found the guy in Iowa. He's a Kansas City Chiefs fan. Couldn't make it. LJ is going to fly him and his family to Tampa so that they can have a cookout sometime later. Two fans, though, on the opposite sides, different walks of life, they don't know each other. Two different teams, two different agendas, two different realities. Showing us what community is supposed to look like in the midst of our cancel culture. If it's this way for these two, this is what life is supposed to be like all of the time. Building community with people who are not like us, who didn't vote like us, who don't think like us, who don't look like us, who don't share all the same values that we do, creating community with them. This is grace. This is a picture of what Jesus does for us. When we can't, Jesus is giving us chicken fingers. We don't deserve it. And so what Jesus has done for us, we do for others. That's how we keep. That's how we keep. Do not murder. Christ has done it for us. We do it for others. Let's pray. Jesus, we canceled you, yet you gave us forgiveness. And we didn't deserve it. Make us people who, in the midst of a culture that laughs and mocks at forgiveness, may we be forgiving people. May we be the first ones offering grace to people who don't deserve it, at least in our minds. May we set the standard. May the table set this agenda for our city. Make the table a safe place, a safe house, where people know that they can come and not be canceled. May each one of us, in whatever we're doing through our lives, may we be known as people that are safe people to talk to, because we don't cancel. Thank you for all you're doing for us. In your name I pray. Amen.